We are so excited to be here with all of you. This workshop is called A Conversation on Christ-Centered Dating and Marriage for LGBTQ Christians. My name is Karen Keene. I am a spiritual director and educator with the Redwood Center for Spiritual Care and Education.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Joel Hollier. I'm dialing in from Sydney, Australia this morning. Or afternoon for you guys, or wherever it is. I'm praising God for the technology that we have in the midst of uncertain times. The fact that we can actually gather from around the world, how incredible. I am a PhD student finishing up this year, hopefully, looking at the experiences of LGBTQIA plus people in the evangelical church in an Australian context. I also have the joy of working as a chaplain and a social worker, part-time both, and have just been part of a new little church plant in Sydney, which is bringing me great joy.
Nice. Yeah.
And I'm Matthew Vines. Oh, sorry, Karen.
No, go ahead.
I'm Matthew Vines. I run an organization called the Reformation Project, and I wrote a book called God and the Gay Christian that came out 6 years ago now. So I'm just excited to be here and excited for this conversation.
Yeah. So thank you all. So this is going to be a panel discussion, but really more like a coffee shop discussion where we're just chatting about what does Christ-centered dating and marriage look like for LGBTQ Christians? I know that's something that I have wrestled with in life. And so we just want to talk about this. And our goal is hopefully to provide something that will be spiritually nurturing and edifying for you. So the first question that I want to throw out there is, what did you learn about sex, dating, and marriage when you were growing up?
We really jump into the big ones here, don't we? Sex, dating, and marriage. I'll jump in and answer this one first. Yeah. Yes. I grew up in a really beautiful Baptist church in the Blue Mountains, which is just, it's about an hour and a half west of Sydney. It is your classic suburban church. It was deeply evangelical. And I grew up surrounded by people who loved me incredibly well. So I just want to caveat that everything that I say from here with the fact that I loved that church, and I still love a lot of people who are a part of my life from that church. Part of existing in that world was that sexuality was a really complicated matter. It was between two things. One, it was never spoken about. So it was always just put under the rug. And I discovered that when you don't speak about things, it breeds shame, it breeds confusion, it breeds darkness. But then there were occasions when it was spoken about, particularly in my little Christian school that I went to. It was spoken about in, I guess, what we would call today purity culture terms. Every analogy under the sun came up, but one that sticks is, I don't know if you guys ever came across the chewing gum analogy, the idea that, once chewed, gum is no longer good. And so that was something that I had kind of growing up, that if I had sex before marriage, it would make me somewhat like chewed gum. Like that's a gross image, isn't it? But it was what I was taught and what I thought at the time. I guess the balance to that, though, was I watched my parents' marriage, which to this day I find really inspiring and really beautiful. And so I watched their marriage and the way that they related to one another, the way that they loved each other. And it was something that I wanted. Like it was something that resonated with me, something that I found really inspiring, something encouraging. Like they had and they have, I guess, a security in each other that was really quite admirable to watch. And so all that was kind of in there in the midst, and then you hit 12, 13, 14, 15, you hit 16, and you realize that, this gay thing is not going anywhere. Like it's here, and it feels like more than just a phase. And so all that stuff that I'd learned about sex and sexuality covered in shame and darkness, that was just it blew up in my face exponentially. If heterosexual sex before marriage was evil and dark and horrendous, then gosh, how much worse is my sin? That was the weight that I was carrying, I guess, inside of myself. So yeah, that's probably the lessons that I had both taught to me and modeled for me, I guess. Like there's kind of two different ways that I learned it there. But honestly, like in recent years, through a lot of reflecting and a lot of talking to people and a lot of trying to tease out my childhood and what that looked like, I can't help but realize somewhere in all that, I always had an idea, perhaps sitting latently inside of me, that that the desires that I had were in some way holy. And that's the only word that I can have for it. That there was something sacred about the desires that I was having for a relationship, and not just sex, but a relationship with another man. And there was always a part of me that said, actually, no, there's something beautiful in this, and I want it. Even though I was, taught and felt like it was somehow not of God. There was something, and we'll get onto this later, but I guess in my mind that was me discovering that to be created in God's image is to be created for relationship, I guess, and that was my learning as I sat with that. So that's quite complicated, isn't it? There was kind of the explicit, the implicit, and then the deep knowledge that was within me. Maybe it was the Holy Spirit's work, I'm not sure, saying that actually, no, something in you is beautiful. Because that wasn't even something I was taught, but it was something that was very much there. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's probably my journey in that.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I can really resonate with that. The kind of a mixture of the both the positive, the negative, the edifying, the difficult. I had a very similar background. I grew up in a conservative evangelical context in the United States. So I was raised conservative Baptist, and I really love my Baptist heritage, especially for the way that it taught me to love Scripture. And but I had kind of a mixed bag. So I would say I would classify it as a distinction between the theoretical and the pragmatic. So I think I grew up with sort of the theoretical. It was sex outside of marriage is not good, and that was taught through things like my youth pastor putting lyrics of secular songs on the PowerPoint and going through and just pointing out these are not helpful lyrics to be listening to, which of course they were not. And so there was an attempt to try to give us wisdom and instruction about what was helpful and edifying. But at the same time, something like talking about song lyrics didn't really get to that deeper part of our my longings and my friends' longings, and especially the curiosity. Like no matter what anybody said, there was just a curiosity. What is this all about? And I want to just try it and see. And so so there was kind of this theoretical aspect of learning about sex, and also some of that purity culture. If you have sex with somebody, you'll have this soul tie. And if you break up, then you will be attached to that person in some way forever, and it will scar you and prevent you from really being able to be committed to your future partner. And, you won't be as marriageable. I don't know if guys have gotten that as much, but certainly, as a woman, we got that message that, a man's not going to want to marry me if I've had sex already. So there was definitely that message as well. And the idea that, it was something so terrible if you crossed that line. Like, it was something irrevocable, very dramatic. And I think that those warnings were an attempt to, maybe not in the best helpful way, and still a certain fear, to not go there, to wait until marriage. But on the positive side, there was that sense in which, faithfulness, being faithful to somebody and committing to somebody and having family, were all good things, that there was value in covenant, and there was a reason for sex being in the context of marriage, is providing a certain stability. But it really did remain theoretical until I got into a sexual relationship. So I just really wasn't prepared for grappling with my sexuality. All the messages that I grew up with were geared toward my heterosexual peers. And so when I realized I was attracted to the same sex, it was really rather traumatic, and I didn't know how to navigate that. I don't think that I really thought that the dating advice that I had been given in youth group, for example, or in other contexts, applied, because I wasn't even supposed to be dating. And so I didn't really know what to do with my longing for connection and relationship. Not only was I not supposed to have sex before marriage, but now I'm not supposed to date at all. And so I think that I really wasn't sure what to do with all of my feelings. And what I really learned the most, I think, from the pragmatic, the practical, the working it out. I think that part of what sanctification is that you're learning to cooperate with the Holy Spirit. But it's like a toddler learning to walk. It's like, I felt like the church was saying, you need to learn to walk without ever falling down. And I didn't know how to do that, because the falling down was the part of learning to walk. At least I found for myself. It was through trial and error. It was through feeling strong sexual desire and being faced with that and falling and getting back up and building that muscle. It came through the actual experience of floundering around and that failure. So, and it reminds me a lot of, I think, of Kohelet in the book of Ecclesiastes, where there's a sense in which he learns experientially what is vanity and what is not vanity. And so I think that we do and can learn from our experiences. And I know that I've learned what is not love and what is love by trial and error and by making mistakes. And so I think one of the most important things I learned growing up and in the dating process and navigating relationships was that making a mistake is not the end of the world. And oftentimes making a mistake is part of growing and becoming stronger in my walk with God. So
it's really interesting to listen to you both, because I feel like the stories that you've shared sound more similar to me to what I commonly hear from other LGBTQ Christians, but not as similar to my own experience. And not to say that my own experience was somehow, the ideal, but by comparison to a lot of stories I hear, I feel sometimes like, wow, I really had a good go of things. So I am from Wichita, Kansas. I was raised in a evangelical family and a conservative Presbyterian church. And I honestly don't really remember almost anything around, in terms of everything that I've learned and read since about purity culture, these ideas that if you have sex outside of marriage, like, here are the bad things that will happen to you, and here's all the bad ways that you should feel about it. I don't remember learning any of that or hearing any of that in church or from my family. And that's not to say that no one ever said anything along those lines. I just don't remember it. So clearly it didn't really stick. And I know for a lot of people, sometimes like one stray comment that they heard, in one sermon will stick with them in a really negative way for years and years and years. But I mean, I remember probably when I was fairly young, when I first even learned what sex was, my parents told me that it was a good thing that was meant to be shared between spouses in marriage. I mean, I'm pretty sure they said, husband and wife in marriage. And so that, that as Christians, we should wait to have sex until marriage. But I never got the message that I think a lot of people get, which is that sex is this dirty, terrible, bad thing until you get married and then it's great. That's just not how I remember hearing about it at all. So I think from a fairly young age, I just thought, all right, that sounds good to me. It's this good thing that's meant for a later time, and all right, sounds good. So I just don't feel like I think this is part of the reason too why when I then did come to terms with being gay, that was my big issue even before I was thinking about it for myself. That's where I really felt a lot of, I kind of just happily accepted at least what my parents shared with me around their values about sexual ethics, just in general. It's the issue of same-sex relationships where I really started to think, this doesn't make sense. This isn't adding up. I was starting to feel all this internal tension, this cognitive dissonance, once I was starting to meet openly gay people in high school. And so, I kind of went through that whole process of rethinking my views on that, studying all of that. But I remember once I got to the point where I changed my mind about that and then was able to ask myself whether or not I was gay, and realized that I was, I remember thinking, well, in terms of, because then a natural next question is about sexual ethics, right? If you are gay and you think that same-sex relationships there's nothing wrong with same-sex relationships. And I remember thinking, well, I've always believed that sex should be for marriage. Why should being gay change that for me? I remember there are all these cultural factors that would impel me to change that. Mostly that there is not much support for living out that ethic if you are openly gay. But I remember just thinking at the level of my own faith, my own theology, my own values, I still think that that is a good thing for me to do. So I'm going to keep doing that. I'm just gay. And of course it is harder if you're gay because we'll get into that. But so I don't feel like I'm sure there could have been what there wasn't, and that there could have been more of. There wasn't a ton of discussion of sexuality in my church. I don't feel like it was some shameful taboo topic, but I do think that there are ways that I'm sure it could have been addressed more. I don't remember anything that sounded shaming to me about it. I do remember comments in youth group and that sort of thing, just about how our culture kind of idolized a lot of things that we shouldn't idolize, sex being one of them. And I think that's true. So that to me is makes sense, but there was not this discussion. I don't think there was there was not an intentional discussion letting people know, hey, you're going to make mistakes when it comes to sexuality. That's okay. I think that would have been helpful. That was not there. But I also feel like I really benefited. And then also just to what Joel said at the beginning too, I think I benefited so much from the example of my parents' marriage. That's part of what made it, I think, maybe more readily and happily just kind of accept and feel good about what they were sharing with me, because I saw them living this out. I knew that those were their values. Those are the values they had always held and that they had lived out. And the fruit of it in their lives was very good. So to me, it wasn't just around sexual ethics, but even just the concept of marriage as something that I wanted in my life made a lot of sense to me, because I saw such a positive example of that every day. I know for a lot of people, if that's not their background, if that's not the example they had, it's not as natural to then have a desire for it. If you don't see, or if the example that you see in your life is something that is so much, it's just not what you would want. So in that sense, I just feel I feel I was very blessed and fortunate, both by my my family and my church environment. It's not that everything was perfect, but I felt like I was given some good values, some good guidance. And then what I'm most grateful for is my parents, when I did come out, were willing to walk that journey with me and reconsider their perspective on that, which has made a huge impact in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Matthew.
It's so interesting hearing just amongst us the voices that we've had feed into our lives and the influences that have shaped us. Like I think sometimes we just don't stop and reflect on that enough to say, hey, it was my parents, it was my school, my church, like there were so many. And so our challenge is to weave all those together and, weave them in with scripture and find out, well, what is good? What are the good voices? What are the voices that have been harmful? So I guess that kind of it feeds into our next question a little bit that I might just roll with. What are some of the challenges that you've noticed when it comes to sexual ethics for Christians, especially LGBTQ Christians? What are some of the challenges that you've noticed either in yourselves or in your communities, the people around you?
Well, I'll start us off here. There are a lot of challenges. I think I've benefited just from reading and learning and listening to a lot of people who had more negative experiences growing up in the church than I did. And that's helped me to understand some of the challenges that I didn't face directly. And I think you two will probably be able to talk to those in more detail. But I think regardless, even if you had the best childhood experience possible, I think a real challenge for LGBTQ Christians when it comes to sexual ethics is just that it's so hard to find a church that is even able to get to that point in the conversation, because so often just our own presence, just our identity alone creates such debate or discord that you can't even get to that question that everybody else has already been thinking about from when they were a teenager. So I think the lack of community support is a huge challenge for people. I also know, especially for those who would hold a value of reserving sex for marriage, that is not the norm in our culture. It never really has been, at least not in our lifetimes. And so I think no matter your sexual orientation, it's a challenge to do anything that requires kind of going against the grain. That's just, it's not as easy if you're, most people are swimming in one direction, you're trying to swim the other direction. But for people who are straight and have that value, there are places they can go, and it's almost always churches, where they can find real support and community in supporting them in that value and in living that out. Whereas if you're LGBTQ, almost all the churches that are most focused on, that have the most clarity around that being their value, are not affirming. And so it's very difficult, I think. And then add on to that, if people just experience family rejection and other kinds of rejection, or rejection from, if you end up experiencing rejection from, say, 90% of your Christian friends and family who hold that view of sexual ethics in general, then that's naturally just, even if you still held that view, your support structure in living that out has just dwindled to something very minimal. So I think that we just really underestimate how critical community support is for all kinds of things. It's not just a sexual ethic. Just think about for being married and having a marriage and that relationship, that having community support for that is so critical for so many other parts of our life too. But I think then we can be kind of too hard on ourselves sometimes, because everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, when it comes to something as complicated as sexuality, no one's going to do everything perfectly. No one's ever going to look back and say, yes, there's nothing that I wish I would have done a little bit differently at this point or that point. Of course not. It is a learning process. But if you, on top of that, kind of feel like you're all on your own as you're navigating that, it's going to be a lot harder. You probably will end up making more mistakes or doing more things that you look back and be like, I'm not sure about that in retrospect. And so I think just giving ourselves a little bit of grace, but I think that is hard for people, especially when they feel like shame was deeply embedded in how they learned about these things originally growing up. Trying to give yourself grace when a lot of your internal kind of the things that you've imbibed over the years are telling you not to give yourself grace, I think that can be a real challenge for people. So that's one thing I would note.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think what comes to mind is, the dichotomy between purity culture versus the reaction to purity culture. So I think, purity culture has been a real issue in causing shame around sexual desires and exploring sexuality. And on the other hand, I feel that the reaction to purity culture of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, which maybe I think what you were kind of alluding to, Matthew, sort of I don't want anything even remotely connected to what I learned from the church. And even though some of us have gotten negative shame-based messages or fear-based messages, the church does have a wonderful theology of sexuality and marriage that we'll talk about more today. But I think the solution to that, it's not purity culture, it's not the reaction to purity culture, but it's a wisdom and spirit-based approach versus rule and fear-based approach. So I think I really learned growing up a rule-based approach. You don't do this, you don't do that, and you wait till marriage. And it became, the spiritual life became like a measuring stick of, did I break this rule, and that would evoke shame, rather than spirit filled. So Paul the Apostle says in Romans 7 that sin takes an opportunity through the rule, that the rules arouse sin, because sin is really excited to break the rules. It's kind of like when we see a sign that says, do not walk on the grass, or we're in a museum and there's a sign that says, don't touch. And I don't know about you, but all of a sudden I want to run on the grass and I want to touch whatever that is. There's something about the rule that evokes the desire that maybe wouldn't have been evoked in the first place. So the fear-based, rule-based approach that a lot of us had been exposed to is actually counterproductive and to living out a Christ-centered sexuality. So what is the solution? Paul said it's freedom. And he said, but don't use your freedom for, self-indulgence. Use it for loving your neighbor, loving others. And it's just paradoxical intention, kind of like if I'm experiencing anxiety, the more I try to suppress that anxiety, the more it usually bubbles up. If I just kind of go like, okay, so I feel anxious, and I kind of give myself this freedom, I could walk on the grass. I could touch that object in the museum, but maybe that's really, when I think about it, when it allows me to think about my motives. When I have freedom, it allows me to think about my motive, and what it is my deepest desire. And so when I'm acting out of my deepest desire, that's what can inspire us and compel us in a Christ-centered life. I can say, you know what, I could do this, but deep down, that's not what I really want. I really want this bigger vision that God has given around, if we're talking about sexuality, covenant, and commitment and fidelity. So I think, again, the problem is purity culture and reaction to purity culture, and the solution to that is a spirit filled way of walking. We're looking at not rules, but we're looking at how do I love well, how do I act with wisdom, not do this or don't do that, but what kind of person am I? What kind of person, how can I be most loving with this person that I'm dating? How can I be most patient and kind? And the fruit of the Spirit. So it's about the fruit of the Spirit and my character, and not this external rule that's exerting external pressure.
Yeah, Karen, as you were saying that, like that was so helpful to put it in that way, that almost dichotomy. And I can't help but think that rules are easy, rules are nice, and they're comfortable, and structures are safe, I think, for a lot of people. And so naturally, humans, I tend to think, feel more comfortable with black and white. That's just the reality of the way that we're made up. Wisdom and character driven and seeking deeper understandings is harder, I think. And so I think that for me, at least, that has been a struggle to say, actually, no, I don't need to follow these rules, but I need to be wise. But wisdom is going to take a whole lot more effort than just following rules. And so I think for me, it's really easy just to fall back on those old rules and patterns. And part of my research that I'm doing, it's through the lens of trauma for LGBTQIA plus Christians in the church. And what does it look like to go into a church where you know that you're not welcome, or to exist in a space where you know you aren't affirmed? And what we're seeing over and over again in all these research papers from around the world is that those are instances of trauma for so many people. And especially in recent years, we're recognizing the impact that trauma has on the brain, not just as a child, but also as an adult. And when you're in an instance where you don't feel safe, where you don't feel like you can let your guards down, where you've been hurt before and you're nervous about being hurt again, it's really hard to access the cortex, the part of your brain that allows you to do deep thinking, that allows you to actually critically reflect and think on, okay, well what am I being driven by? And so my sense is that, well, I know in my own journey, and when I look at a lot of the people around me, is that so often we're in this state of fear, and it might not feel like fear. It might stem up as anxieties, or it might stem up as dissociation and silence and sitting there. It might just be total avoidance. But we're in this state, so many of us, of what I would call trauma, that we just need something to hold on to. We just need something to grab onto that feels like it is stable enough to support our weight while we're healing. And Matthew, as you said, those communities just aren't there. They don't exist for so many queer Christians around the world, or LGBT Christians, or they're not present. And so, well, what do you do when the rules are the one thing that was holding you, but now those rules are the one thing that are oppressing you? You need to create a new set of rules, because you're not in a place cognitively to just go with wisdom, or like that. It's really hard to do it. And so the easiest thing to do is throw the rule book out. It's black or white. It's, well, there were rules. Well, now let's get rid of the rules. But that then just leaves us with a new task of saying, well, what is good in this situation? And I don't know, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, gosh, this is complicated. Like there is nothing simple about sexual ethics in the best of days, let alone when we're just trying to stay afloat, or just trying to, get our parents to come on board with a new relationship. It's so hard to navigate. And so for me, as I look at this, I believe that we have a God of healing, a God who sees trauma and that breaks God's heart. And God truly desires that we are healed of that trauma in community. And we come to see beauty again in the creation and in who we are. But I guess it's getting to that point that is the challenge. And so I think, I wish that I had access to conversations like this, where I could see, there are some people who kind of have been through it, have done some, I don't know, deconstructing is a really confusing term these days, but they've taken apart some of those old ways of thinking, and they've reformed some new ways of thinking, so that there's something I can stand on. There's something that I can actually, and it's not rules, as you said, Karen. It's not strictures and boundaries that are holding me in, but it's a platform that elevates me and elevates my standing before God and before the community, and me and myself. I can actually feel comfortable in this. I wish that I had conversations like that back in the day. Chances are they were happening, but in my little Blue Mountains bubble, I didn't have access to them. So yeah, I think that's we can talk about all the symptoms of that, but for me, that is the some of the root, at least, of what's taking place in our communities. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, I think that the topic of trauma is really important, and it reminds me of that book, The Velvet Rage, where that author, I think he's a psychologist, talks about trauma and the impact that it's had on the LGBTQ community, and the way that internalized oppression can lead to sometimes acting out in very dysfunctional ways, because we're acting out our shame, or and so an attempt to heal ourselves in ways that are not very helpful, seeking affirmation. So I resonate with this. I think there's a lot more that could be explored. We could do a whole workshop just on trauma, and I'd be really interested to know more about your research on that.
Totally. And I think the danger is pathologizing behavior too much. I think, we don't want to go too far down that line, but there's so much to be said for just patterns of behavior that we see, not just in sexual ethics, not just in LGBTQI plus people, but across the board, people who have experienced adverse moments in their life. There's a season of floating and grabbing hold of things. And Matthew, as you said, often it's in hindsight, we look back at those things and we say, maybe that wasn't the best thing to grab hold of. But I just want to extend that grace to say, look, you were doing the best you could. Like you were trying, and I'm sorry that we let you float for so long without being there for you. That's not on your head at this point. Like that is the community had to get around you. And for all of us, there are times when we just need to be carried, and that takes swallowing pride. But for some people, I just want to look and say, hey, let me carry you for a moment, because I've been carried, and gosh, I appreciated it.
Yeah. Good word.
Yeah. And then the one thing that you made me think of, Karen, when you were talking about paradoxical intention with rules, I think another thing that contributes to just a challenge for LGBTQ Christians in thinking through sexual ethics is that so often it's not just that people were given rules, but they were given rules with warnings as well that turned out to be false. So if you're told at the museum, do not touch, and if you touch this, you will be arrested and thrown out of the museum. And then you touch it and you're not arrested and thrown out of the museum, then, well, I guess that's not true. And so many people were told, do not have sex outside of marriage. And if you do, the following bad things will inevitably happen to you, right? You will feel full of shame. Now, in some cases, people do as a direct result of just being told that they should. But then other people will be like, well, I don't feel shame, so I guess all of that, or you will not be able to have a satisfying sexual relationship once you're married. That's not true. It's empirically false. And so if people are given these empirically false warnings, obviously that undermines whatever the warning was attached to in the first place. And it undermines the credibility of the people who taught that to you. And so I think that's something churches have to be really careful about. I know that oftentimes people's parents or church leaders are just trying to protect people, because it is true. Like sexuality, there's all kinds of pitfalls involved. Like there is a lot of vulnerability there. And I think people can end up getting hurt. And so I think a lot of people, parents and other church leaders, they don't want people to get hurt. And so they say, well, because it's possible you could get hurt in this way, I'm just going to tell you, you will be hurt in this way. But the problem is, if you're too sweeping in your predictions, then you lose credibility ultimately, because, you say, if you cross the street without looking, you will get hit by a car. Well, you might, but you're not necessarily going to get hit by a car. So, but it doesn't mean that then it's a bad idea to look both ways before crossing the street, right? It's still a good idea, but that's why we should also just be careful that we're not trying to claim too much. I think too many people just claim too much, and that has really undermined the, whatever theological message and even positive messages that were in that people were trying to share. So,
yeah.
So, and on that theological point, kind of our final question for our conversation today is about that. What does a theologically rich and Christ-centered sexual ethic look like? And what about it inspires you for your own life?
Yeah. This is where the rubber meets the road. And the thing that sticks out to me the most, that I keep coming back to, is covenant. And I don't know, I don't feel like I was taught a really rich view of covenant, but covenant to me, it brings to mind that whole image of God's faithfulness to us. It brings to mind Jesus's statement, "I will never leave you nor forsake you," and the beauty of commitment and fidelity, and knowing that someone is going to be there and is reliable and trustworthy. I didn't experience sort of that stability in some of my dating relationships and stuff, but now that I'm engaged, I've experienced that sense of stability and how much that's different to look at covenant and think, this person's going to be with me for life. This person has my back and I have their back, and the beauty of that. And it calls to mind really what I think Scripture teaches about the human need, that the human being, it's not good for the human being to be alone, and that God created not with just a sex drive, but with a familial drive. We're not really just talking about sex here. We're talking about something much bigger. We're talking about leaving and cleaving and forming a new kinship bond, a new kinship unit. We're talking about that need for each of us that we have to be connected to family. And when I look at the Scriptures, I'm looking for what did the Scriptures teach me about the best context for sex? And I know a lot of times people can read the Scriptures and think, oh my gosh, there's just some really random, strange things in Scripture about sexual ethics, polygyny or whatnot. But there's actually a real coherence to the sexual ethics in Scripture, even when we're looking at, for example, polygyny. And that's true for most societies across history and culture. There's usually a coherence there. And the coherence is usually around community well-being. So, for example, if you live in a time and place or situation where you are reliant on offspring for survival, to be able to farm the land to eat, to be able to take care of you when you're old, offspring are not just elective in the way that they are in the West today. I mean, it certainly wasn't elective in antiquity, and even in some places of the world today where you need those offspring. And if your first spouse is infertile, it could become a matter of life and death that you don't have kids. And so it makes sense to take another wife so that you can have children, so that you can survive and thrive. There's usually a rhyme or reason. It's not just, men collecting wives because they're just have lustful appetites and they just want to have sex with a lot of women. That's really not what had driven polygyny, for example, throughout history. So all that to say, when I look at the Scriptures, I'm seeing an underlying principle of it's about community well-being. It's about the stability that provides, and so it's not just my own individualistic desire. It's about community and community building, and I think that dovetails with that familial drive about creating a kinship unit and the way that kinship and family stability and that fidelity creates something that is flourishing, not just for my own individual self, but it creates flourishing for the community as a whole.
Yeah, Karen, that was so beautifully said. I feel like in some ways what you just did and what we're doing in this whole discussion is we're marrying together theology and psychology in some sense, like that what I would say woven into creation, desire for safety, for community, for stability, and the word that you touched on, which I know is important for all of us, is for the three of us, I'm saying, is covenant, and the nature of covenant as a two-way activity that takes place. And so for me, as I made my vows to my husband, I stood there and I said, I vow to you, I promise that I will be there with you, for you, through sickness and in health unto death. That was the promise that I made. And honestly, they were scary promises. Like, there's nothing light about that. There's nothing easy about saying those words. And I think historically, people have taken that really easily, and it's hard to say. Like, it's a complicated and big decision. I guess the flip side is, as I was standing there, Thomas, my husband, was saying the same things back at me. It wasn't just me saying it to him to say, look, I'm going to give up myself and goodbye, Joel. It's I'm doing this with the full knowledge that I am trusting that you will do that for me. We've been married for 18 months now. And what I'm seeing and what I'm learning, and it's taking a long time to learn and will probably take my life, is that I can just rest. I can rest in the knowledge that I have somebody who is there for my flourishing. That's really beautiful. My experience of that is that is so affirming and so life-giving and so powerful. That makes me more courageous. That makes me more courageous to try new things and to step out into new adventures. And because I do have someone there, but that only works because of covenant. That only works because we have made that commitment to say, I am going to give myself to your flourishing. And in a sense, I think that is a good definition of love. I think a good definition of love is givenness. And the context of marriage is just one way that givenness plays out, I guess, in really profound ways. And for me, reading something like Ephesians 5 in new ways, where historically it was used to suppress the role of women in a marriage, and then it was used to say that actually no, gay relationships can't exist because it's very clearly man woman, and to look at that with new eyes and say, actually no, that is the narrative of Christ submitting himself and Christ giving of himself. And I think that's such an important word, giving of. Christ actually using his power for the sake of the other. That's the narrative of Ephesians 5. If you go and have a read of it, and if you can kind of filter out some of that patriarchal language, what I think is behind it is that really beautiful understanding of saying, I am here for your thriving. And for me, that is such a deep ethic. Like that is truly woven into the way that I experience the world and the way that I experience relationships and the way that I now experience my marriage. And that it needs to have as its foundation a desire for the other, a desire for selflessness. And I think that's where sex comes into it as well. Sex is, as I grew up and understood it more, that recognition, as I said earlier, that it was holy or that it was sacred, like that understanding then naturally I think filters into covenant to say, that the covenant becomes something that is really beautiful and holy and sacred. And so the bringing of those two ideas together has been what for me has been the foundational ethic, I think. That's how I've kind of grown to understand where sex fits in life, where sex fits in marriage, and how the two are just really stunningly woven together. I think that's been my journey in thinking through that.
That's lovely, Joel, and I loved hearing about your marriage. Thanks for sharing that.
I some of my thoughts are very similar. Some things that I would add. One phrasing that I really appreciate. So in Jim Brownson's book, Bible, Gender, Sexuality, which I've got here in case anybody wants to see the cover, I really love how he kind of tries to whittle down the ethic of scripture around sexuality to say that we should be saying with our bodies what we are able and willing to say with the rest of our lives. And he bases that on his reading of the phrase one flesh, first in Genesis 2, but then looking at the New Testament uses of that phrase and how much sex is being tied into lifelong bonding. But I love that because it's not a rule, right? So it's not just a do this or do not do this. It's a principle, but a principle that isn't so elastic that it can just be. I think some of the reasons some people are drawn to rules is because they feel like without rules, it's what you were talking about earlier, Karen. Everybody just wants to do whatever we want to do, and some people are like, no, we got to have some rules. We've got to have some order. And so I'm sympathetic to the attitude. Of course, we see it's the problems that can come from an over reliance on rules as well. So what I appreciate about his principle of aligning what we're saying with our body, with what we're saying with the rest of our life, is that I think it does point us in a fairly clear direction. But it also allows us to, the whole question of like, well, where is the line? Which I think is one of the questions that, bedevils many a youth pastor, but also one of the questions that can lead many people to kind of just question or kind of do away with everything that they learned around sexuality, because the Bible does not give you a 100% answer on exactly where the line is. Now, I, personally probably have a more conservative view on that than maybe, the average person, and that's no surprise. But like, being able to think about it at a principle, it's not like, because otherwise people are just like, here's the line. And of course, what do we do? Just like we were saying with the rules, we just get as close to the line as possible and then, go beyond it. And then you kind of wonder, well, that line's just annoying me. Like, what's it doing? Getting in the way of, my, whatever I would like to do. So what I like about having that principle is it gives us a way of thinking about our choices that we can apply to all kinds of situations. And if we're really thinking about it, to me, if to align what we're saying with our body with what we're saying with the rest of our life, as I think about and like meditate on that idea, it really makes me feel just most comfortable and confident in thinking about if I'm going to give a total bodily self-gift to someone else, I want that to be in the context of a total life self-gift. I think there is a beauty in that security. There's a beauty in that congruence of the bodily language. So honestly, I love that. I love that way of thinking. I find it really encouraging to me, even though that's not the norm, like in our culture. And so that's the way in which it is discouraging, is that it can be hard and it can be frustrating sometimes when you're kind of, maybe for people, if you're scrolling on a dating app and you're just thinking, but who would actually even agree with me or be willing to, support or respect this view of mine? It can be hard, harder than it should be. But in my experience, it has been worth being patient because I just know the sense of security that I feel like being in a relationship with someone who shares that view, I can't even, I don't know, it feels so good. And it makes me feel so safe and so secure and so loved and respected. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's just what I would say in a nutshell, but I guess, yeah, I could go further, and lots of other books. I certainly would recommend Karen's book. She wouldn't do this, but her book that recently came out, The Bible and Sexuality, is such a great discussion if you want to look at a lot of the biblical texts in more detail.
Thank you for that, Matthew. You know, I think what you were drawing out, Matthew, at least from what I heard you say, is sort of the difference between just checking a box that some external power wants me to check versus a vision of something, a way of life, a way, you know, I love that principle that you drew out of Brownson's book. And I think that's so true. And that ties together with, you know, scripture says that we are a priesthood of believers, and that we have been set apart, and that our bodies matter, and that, yeah, it's a whole way of life and how we live. So I don't know if you have, Joel, if you have any further thoughts.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that, Matthew, what you said. The word congruence, I think, was just so powerfully put there. There is that the marrying up of what our bodies say and what our lives say, and for me that screams integrity, I guess, in that sense. And you know, looking at the narratives of our world, one of the great desires for people, at least in kind of the Sydney context that I'm in, is a desire for integrity and authenticity. And I wonder if that is just another example of that playing out in life, the desire for Karen, as you said, the sacredness of the body to match up with the sacredness of our relationships. And I do think for me that has been a really driving desire that I found a lot of joy and safety and beauty in. I appreciate that.
We need to wrap up, and this has been an amazing conversation. Like,
sure.
I just love this. And but I wonder if we might, if either of you have, you know, community, the sense of community. Where do people find community for living out kind of the vision that we were talking about? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we had this workshop, is there are those of us who have some shared vision around this. And so we are like a little community right here having a conversation. But I wonder about some positive examples of where people can plug in. So I know there's a Facebook group that I co-administrate called the LGBTQ Discipleship Community. So people can get plugged into that Facebook group as a community of like-minded folk. But I wonder if you guys might have some suggestions as well, where people can find community to help live out these values.
It's so important. Let me just touch on from a Sydney context. I know probably those listening aren't from Sydney, but others might hear about it. Across Australia, there's an organisation called Equal Voices, which is doing some phenomenal work, just elevating queer Christian narratives in the church. And I'm always happy down our end of the world to catch up for a coffee and chat, or a Zoom call, because as Karen said, like, gosh, we need community in this. Like, those of you who are slogging it out, feeling alone and on your own, you don't need to. Like, there are people who are doing it as well. And also, I just found Twitter surprisingly helpful once you filter it out, for knowing that you're not alone. That I think is what I found Twitter helpful for, and discovering people. And I know that the three of us are on Twitter as well. But it's just, it was there's pitfalls in there, but helpful for knowing that there's other voices.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I wish there were more. I think that's something that we're certainly hoping to help foster. I would certainly say, follow everything Karen's doing. I think she's doing a lot of great things in terms of some of the community spaces that she's curating online. The Reformation Project, the organization that I run, we're not a community-focused organization in terms of our mission is not to be a community. We work with people in non-affirming churches who want to be equipped theologically to be able to help be a voice for change in their congregations. But within that, certainly community does develop. And one of our values as an organization is monogamy and covenant. That's an important part of the message that we're sharing with our non-affirming brothers, sisters, and family in Christ, that we really believe that sex is sacred and sexuality is sacred. And we're not here to be arguing with that or trying to undermine that. We just want LGBTQ Christians to be able to be grafted into both the same level of support, but also the same level of responsibility in marriage and sexuality that other Christians have, already have kind of available to them. So, I think the Reformation Project, there are ways that, people can get involved and certainly may be able to meet people through that as well. So those are some options, but hopefully there will be more in time and more communities for people.
Yes. And certainly CenterPeace would be a wonderful organization that is community-based for people to get involved in as well. So we are going to turn to the Q&A time, but just thank you so much, Joel and Matthew. I just really have enjoyed this conversation. So let's go see what questions and comments people have.
All right.
Beautiful. Thank you.